Okay, so welcome everyone to tonight's webinar. I'm Keren Sar. I'm the Director of Development here at the Israel Religious Action Center. Tonight's webinar is about the new government of Israel, its influence on religious and state issues, and the Israel-Diaspora relationship. Before we begin, I wanted to share a couple of housekeeping items with everyone. We're going to record this webinar, and you should expect it to get it by probably tomorrow. So if you have any difficulties, connection, or you have to drop out earlier, don't worry. Ask us some questions. There is a Q&A box or a chat box on the bottom of the screen usually. Ask us a question. We're going to leave about 15 to 20 minutes time for questions. And we're very honored and happy to have Rabbi David Saperstein to moderate tonight's discussion, tonight or today, depending on where you are. Rabbi Saperstein is the president of the World Union for Progressive Judaism. He served as the U.S. ambassador at large for international religious freedom and was for over 40 years the director of the Religious Action Center, the Israel Religious Action Center, brother and sister organization. So without further ado, I'm handing over the mic to you, David, and to introduce tonight's speakers and to start off the webinar. Thank you. Stop the share.
Thank you, Karen. I'm really honored and delighted to do this. This is an extraordinary thing. Let me just say one word of further explanation here. I was asked both to introduce the speakers that we have, but also to set the context for the topic that we're going to discuss as well. It's hard to think of a more urgent time to be dealing with these issues than we are right now. The implications for Israel's democracy are self-evident. Of the new government, the implications for the Jewish character of Israel, self-evident. The implications for the rights of non-Orthodox streams, self-evident. But as each of you knows, these factors combined with the Israel-Palestinian issue also have very powerful resonance with Israel-Diaspora relations in general and the connection that Jews outside of Israel have for Israel as well. And in all of this, it is very difficult to think of an entity or two individuals who play a more important role than Anat Hoffman, Noah Satah, and the Israel Religious Action Center. When I was involved with working with Ori Regev in the founding era of the Israel Religious Action Center, he had me come over twice to help think through what are the lessons to be learned from the U.S. North American Religious Action Center, and the extraordinary work that it does for the Israel Religious Action Center, for a community that is very different in terms of the political configuration, without elected officials for states, from localities that people are accountable for. What kind of leverage do you have? How do you have that? What would be needed? And some of the core lessons of the willingness to, as fearlessly as we can, speak truth to power, to stand up, to be assertive in the advocacy and the legal steps that we take on behalf of the fundamental values that we hold precious, and the ability to empower those we represent to be effective advocates for the work we do. All of these were built into what happened in the evolution of the Religious Action Center. But what Ori began and Anat and Noah have taken to new heights so surpasses what our dreams were back then. IRAC has become first amongst equals of all of the players on behalf of not just religious freedom, but litigating on the rights of immigrants and standing up against growing racism in elements of extreme extreme segments of the Jewish community. The ability to go into court, to go into the Knesset here, and to stand up effectively on behalf of those rights is really extraordinary. And Anat's ability to kind of see opportunities, moments of opportunity, and to grab hold of them is something I know almost everyone on this line has witnessed firsthand, and just is awed at here. Like many of you, I had the opportunity to ride a bus with Anat. And after she just stood up against everyone who told her to move to the back of the bus and persuaded Orthodox women who got on, they should sit with her and talk with her, and just watch this extraordinary thing at play. Here we got to the end, it was just the two of us left on the bus. We clearly had a sympathetic bus driver. And afterwards, the guy said to us as we were chatting, said, you know, you're lucky if you come in just on another run, just if I had been doing it 15 minutes later, it might have been a much larger group of Orthodox men, and they would have just mobilized to stand up against you. And she said, and I would have stood as firm against it. What would you have done? Would you have stood up for my rights? Here, and the guy said, you got to be kidding. Of course I would. I know you sue people. Here. So this bus driver, intimidated by the possibility of being sued there by the Religious Action Center, if he didn't stand up to ensure that women were treated equally in the civic life of Israel, here, it's simply because of the reputation of IRAC, the reputation of Anat Hoffman. And what Noah Satab brought in terms of not just her rabbinic training, but in terms of a background on behalf of LGBTQ rights here and women's rights, and what Anat brought in terms of her long willingness to fight for civil rights and women's rights in many different contexts, but the legendary work she did on the Jerusalem City Council, standing up to extreme elements of the religious community. It's very different in the way that their two skills complement each other. It's very hard to think about two people who we could have better placed to fight on behalf of Reformed Jewish rights, on behalf of the social justice values that we see as absolutely central to an authentic understanding of Judaism. They make us proud every day. Let me just set a little bit of the context a little bit more, and then I'll turn it over to them. First, in terms of Israel-Diaspora relations, let me try to take the annexation issue out of it by going back just a year before it really heated up to the 2018 versus the 2019 American Jewish Committee poll of American Jewish attitudes. In 2018, 70% of American Jews said that caring about Israel is a very important part of what it means to them to be a Jew. 1 year later, it fell from 70% to 62%. In 2018, 79% said that a thriving state of Israel was vital for the future of the Jewish people. By 1 year later, it had fallen 7% to 72%. In 2018, 15% said they expect ties to weaken between Israel and diaspora Jewry in the next 5 years. By 1 year later, it had gone from 15 to 24%. In 2018, 15% said that Israel should be willing, and this is an issue beyond what IRAC deals with, but it clearly affects the relations between diaspora Jewry and Israel, that Israel should be willing to dismantle all the settlements as part of a treaty. That went up by 10% by the following year. Some Israelis, particularly on the West Bank issues, are moving in the other direction, but growingly they are supportive of the agenda that IRAC represents in terms of fundamental rights, in terms of the rights of non-Orthodox streams in Israel. In no small measure because of the work that IMPJ and IRAC have done to build the strong reform movement and to be such effective advocates for Reformed Jewish rights here. At the same time, the reasons for hope in terms of Israel-diaspora relations, with growing dissatisfaction over policies, we're still at a point where overwhelmingly, when you set the question about Israel in broad terms. Are you generally supportive of Israel? Do you care for Israel? Do we have a shared destiny together? Overwhelmingly, American Jews still say yes to that, while growingly disappointed in particular policies. Someday that will wear off if we don't get the policies in line with the general values that Israel has. And you tell me, what entity is more dedicated and more effective in making those coextensive, the values of Israel enshrined in policies that Israel as an idea represents for all of us. So it's not too late, and there's much that we have to do on this. Here, look, what we hear here, most of you are from North America, majority of you from the United States. Let me just speak in that context for a moment. There are key differences. In the United States, we have a bicameral form of government that keeps checks one on the other, the House and the Senate. We don't have that in Israel. We have in Israel, in the United States, we have a strong constitution. There is none in Israel. In the United States, there's a strong Bill of Rights. There is none in Israel. In the United States, there is a separation of powers between the executive branch and the legislative branch, where that balance between them keeps them in check with each other. That's not true in Israel, where the two are functionally merged together. Here in the United States, where the accountability that comes from elected officials who represents a discrete constituency and has to answer to that constituency. With the party system in Israel being elected, we don't have that same kind of accountability. In the United States, we have a balance between federal and state power enshrined in the 10th Amendment of the Constitution that reserves to the states any power that isn't explicitly given to the federal branch. So there's another check and balance that we have. It's a very effective check and balance. Today, only the court in Israel, the court system in Israel, and the Supreme Court provides that check for balance. So that's a major difference. We're going to hear more about what that means in just a moment here from Anat. So this is a very powerful part of what we have here. And the other part is that depends on a free and independent court. And today there are efforts to limit the authority of the court and the legitimacy of the court and of the legal system and the rule of law, of legal advice, politicized legal advice in each of the ministries of the government in Israel, to limit even an attacks on the police authority of independence, et cetera. So we see these broad struggles that we face here. So there are reasons for deep concern, but a number of reasons for hope. If you look at the blue and white platform, almost every piece of our central agenda was affirmed in what the platform said. Whether this will hold as a party is kind of split in elements most supportive of us remains to be seen. We'll be hearing more from Noah about that. But those key parts are there. And blue and white has certain ministries that will affect control of certain ministries and the appointments they'll make that will affect almost every one of the issues we care about. There's a lot that can be done within that, even if new laws don't really have a chance of being passed. So we are going to hear from arguably the two best experts of doing this, two people who make us proud every day to be Reformed Jews. Bless you for the work that you do. And let me turn it over to Anat Hoffman.
Well, thank you. Thank you, David. I get showered by compliments. It's wonderful to hear it all in English. Particular today was Rosh Chodesh Sivan, and at the wall I heard, well, somewhat to the contrary. Israel is in a crisis, and I thank you all, 252 participants, that are interested in hearing this, what makes this crisis. First, we have a health crisis like everybody else. We have an economic crisis and we have a political crisis, and all of these three merge together to make a serious moment of concern in Israel's history. Our prime minister today sat on the dock, sat on the bench that is the bench for criminals in our local court here in Jerusalem. He is charged he's charged with bribery, breach of trust, and fraud. Our prime minister, Benjamin Netanyahu. There are Israelis who are demonstrating for Netanyahu, saying that he was wronged, and this is all a plot, and this is a fake trial. It's a plot by the left to take and seize government, which we weren't able to do in the election. So they're doing it through the courts. And there are Israelis who are demonstrating for integrity and are saying that everyone is governed by the same law. This trial that started today has dominated the last year in Israel. We've seen Mr. Netanyahu try every possible move in the book to try to delay the trial, annul the trial, forget the trial, and of course, make the whole legal system in Israel suspect of its own motives. The people who say that this is a fake trial that is meant to just change the rule of who rules Israel are not people in the market, people in the street. This is the Speaker of the Knesset, the Minister of Justice. Serious leaders of Israel are actually questioning our Attorney General and the whole legal system and the Ministry of Justice. And just like we have this horrible thing going on, we are looking at Israelis in one of their best moments in what I remember. Israelis learned to stand in line. Israeli society is showing that it's very strong fighting the coronavirus. In Israel this morning, we have 279 deaths out of 9.3 million. There are more ministers in the government than people on respirators in Israel right now. But we are exhausted, and as a result, we're very fragile. We're exhausted because in the last 12 months, we had 3 elections. We had one in April, where Netanyahu got 35 seats and blue and white got 35 seats. We had one in September, where Netanyahu got 32 seats and blue and white got 33 seats. And then we had another one just now in March, when Netanyahu got 36 seats and blue and white got 33 seats. You realize the numbers are very, very close. Our Knesset has 120 people in it. So 33 and 32, these numbers are around 25%, 26% of the Knesset. There must be a coalition of at least 61 to form a government. That's why we had 3 elections, because nobody was able to form a government. In this last election, we became 2 blocks, a block of 58, which was the right wing together with the ultra-Orthodox, and a block of 55, which was the left together with the centrists. One would think that this is a strong competition to Netanyahu, but no. The left and the center were very fragmented, while the ultra-Orthodox and Netanyahu are a very cohesive group. And as you know, the cohesive group usually gets to have the final word. Sadly, these elections showed that our democracy is somewhat hollow because members of Knesset threatened each other, calling each other traitors if they'd be willing to sit with the Arabs. Let me just remind you that the 15 members of the Arab Party in Israel are Israeli citizens. They're not criminals. They've not broken any law. They are a different race, but they are Israelis. They belong to different religions. They're not Jewish, but to claim that to sit with the Arabs is to be a traitor to Israel is something false that runs against our main democratic values. Israel needs a democracy. And for us to have a democracy, we must have the freedom of speech, the separation of authorities, and we must have our courts. Just as a side note, you should know that the 17 Arabs that were voted to the Knesset this election is the most Arabs ever in Israel's history in the Knesset. And the 30 women, who are 1/4 of the Knesset, is the most women we've had in the Knesset. We need a dialogue between democracy and Judaism. It would be good for both. But right now in Israel, democracy is running against democracy, and Judaism are 2 trains on the same track going right against each other. Some people say that democracy has run its course in Israel, and it's time for Judaism to take over. God help us all. We in our movement, the Reform movement, we were able to have democracy and Judaism together. You realize that not all Reform Jews are Likud, and not all Reform Jews are Labor or Blue and White. We come from different parties, and yet we were able to use Judaism as a way to dialogue and to work together for our shared values. And the shared values we share with you guys are gender equality and religious pluralism and overall tolerance. And we believe that these are Jewish values. And this is our message to the Israeli society. We are very fragile right now. The number of unemployed Israelis has risen from 3% to 20%. Without a constitution, just like David explained so well, in the struggle for power, democracy is being trampled. The different elections that we had, reminding you, 3 in 1 year, has caused Netanyahu to basically instill in a very large public in Israel that if we only didn't have democracy, he could bring us all to be safe and secure. Democracy is seen as an obstacle. The media is seen as fake, as an obstacle. The courts are seen as an obstacle. Academia is seen as an obstacle. The left is seen as an obstacle. And you know what? Reform Jews seem to be an obstacle too. There were some very disturbing laws that were discussed and passed in the last year. Laws that are that enshrine Jewish supremacy, ethnocentrism, the Hebrew language being more official than the Arab language. If we want to fit in this neighborhood, how could we not recognize Arabic as one of our national languages? So it seems like Netanyahu and his ilk developed a scheming, dark enemy that has to be fought. And every time it's somebody else, but it's causing a great fractionalization in Israel. I want you all, and I don't mean to do it technically, to unmute yourself. Unmute yourself, not in this dialogue, but unmute yourself in America and start being much more engaged in what's happening in Israel. Because what's happening in Israel reflects on all of us, whether you are active or not active. If Israel goes off the rail, this is the only Jewish state on this planet, and it reflects on every one of us. So we have a choice, and we have to roll up our sleeves and stop wringing our hands. It's, by the way, a physical impossibility to roll up your sleeves and wring your hands at the same time. So I strongly suggest let's roll up our sleeves. Let's work together for pluralism, tolerance, and equality. And there are such opportunities. And Rabbi Satat, who is our fearless leader, is going to tell us what they are.
Thank you, David, and thank you, Anat. And
no, let me just ask people. If it's not clear, feel free to start putting questions into the chat box here that we'll raise as Noah is talking here. Noah, to you.
Absolutely. So I wanted to take this opportunity to really try and introduce you, our closest supporters, to the new players and the new opportunities and the new challenges that we're facing. So this image here is from this afternoon. Netanyahu is arriving to appear in court, and all of those people around him are ministers who are showing their support and coming with him to court. I'm very, very curious how a defendant gets a podium to speak to the press from at court. We will look into that tomorrow. But while the trial, after many, many attempts to delay and withhold, has begun today, Anat told me today that there are 250,000 documents to be reviewed by the court. This is going to be a very, very long trial, 2 to 3 years minimum. So Netanyahu is our prime minister. We know the relationship that we have with him. We know the many times that he has behaved in a way that is menacing to democracy, in a way that is racist, in a way that is endangering to Israel's future and his the treatment of the reform movement that has often been very derogatory and dishonest. So he is our prime minister and one of the people that we need to be thinking of, but I wanted to introduce you to some of the new faces that we have. So this is Benny Gantz, who is the leader of Blue and White. He came into the scene after being the chief of staff of the IDF as a big white hope. He ran a campaign for about 2 years. He's a very new politician. He ran 3 election campaigns, and the basic message of the campaign, as Anat said, was about being anti-corruption, being for the rule of law. All 3 election campaigns centered over the question of whether a person who is charged with corruption can still be prime minister, should that person face trial, etc. After many different debates between the corruption charges and the remaining in power, Gantz and Netanyahu, in an about face from all of Gantz's promises, came to a compromise, meaning Netanyahu remains prime minister, which the camp that Gantz led vowed not to agree to. But the promises of maintaining of the rule of law have been made. I also wanted to introduce you to some other very interesting players who are the leaders of Likud. So in Israel, there are 12 different parties in the Knesset today. Likud is the biggest one. That's Netanyahu's party. And while Netanyahu has been a leader for 20 years in that party, there are different contenders who we have been nurturing different relationships with over years and years now. All of those 4 people, Minister Gilad Erdan, who is now going to be the ambassador to the US, Minister Chaim Katz, who is going to be the Minister of the Treasury, Nir Barkat, who used to be the mayor of Jerusalem, and Gideon Sa'ar, who is the arch nemesis of Netanyahu. They're all running on different agendas in the Likud, but they're people to watch, and we're cultivating the relationship with them in the looking forward to the post-Netanyahu era. I want to share with you that we met with Minister Erdan in March, and he told Rick that he had gotten this proposal to be the ambassador to the UN, and he was very interested, but he was sticking around, and he was not taking the job because he wanted to see if this would be the end of the Netanyahu era. Now that he's taken the job, we can understand what he thinks about the current political situation. So the different powers, the Netanyahu and Gantz and their many different advisors have been negotiating what is called the coalition agreement. The coalition agreement is the paper that all of the parties that are part of the coalition, the 61, have to sign to start the new government and start a new Knesset. We didn't have a government for 500 days, 507. It's a long time to be without a standing government. And these leaders have signed a coalition agreement to start us off with a new government. Before I dive into what the coalition agreement says, I want to warn us that these agreements have been notoriously unreliable. They have been broken many, many times, but it's a very important indicator of where the leaders are now and what they're willing to commit to. So the first thing that happens in a coalition agreement is that you divide the roles. These are the ministers of Israel. You remember that we're in an economy in crisis and that each one of these ministers has now a big paycheck and a staff and an office. And these are just the ministers. There are and in addition to those, there are 16 deputy ministers in the different positions. They were planning the first government meeting. This is the table for the government meeting: social distancing and a huge government. This is what it looks like when they want to meet. And the basic idea of the government is that the roles are divided equally between the blue and white camp, which is on the left, and the Likud camp, which includes the ultra-Orthodox, which is on the right. There are many different invented positions here. My personal favorite is the Minister for Higher Education and Water, but I also like the minister who is a liaison between the Knesset and the government. Because they needed so many roles, they just invented different positions for the different ministers. So that's in terms of the division of power in the next government, and we will get back to the division of ministers. But let's talk about the content of the coalition agreement, what the government is committed to. So the first and brilliant news is that this government is committed to the protection of the Supreme Court. You see here the beautiful building of our Supreme Court. All parties have signed a commitment to protect the independence of the judicial arm in Israel. And so the continuing attempts that we've seen over the past few years to erode the power of the Supreme Court, we hope will subside. I want to put a caveat to that the Netanyahu camp is incredibly seasoned. They are very experienced politicians, and the Gantz camp are people who are very enthusiastic but very new. And so we as a civil society have to be incredibly vigilant in making sure that blue and white push Likud to keep that promise. The second and a very disappointing issue is the issue of religion and state. And we've all heard the beautiful promises of blue and white going into the elections. All of the parties to the coalition, including blue and white and labor that got into the government, signed an agreement saying that there will be a freeze to the status quo, which means that there will be no change on issues of religion and state. And if there is a change, for instance, if we win the petition that we have in the Supreme Court over the Kotel or over conversion, or if we win in any other way other than the Knesset, then all of the parties have committed to reversing the situation to what it is today. That's a huge challenge facing us. Of course, it doesn't mean that we're not going to win or that we're not going to try to win, but that's just the reality that has been set in front of us. And we will have to negotiate that both legally and politically. And last, the other very important item in the coalition agreement is the Annexation Plan. One of the only pieces of legislation that the government has committed to advancing very quickly. While they have said that the first 6 months of this government would be dedicated to the focusing on the Corona crisis. Annexation the legislation on annexation is set to begin on July 1st. And again, very disappointingly, both Labor and Blue and White signed the coalition agreement that says that the government will promote this legislation. They will not necessarily vote for the legislation, but they don't need to vote for it. Netanyahu has enough votes even without Blue and White and Labor. So that's so these are kind of the major principles of the government. And like everything that I'm going to say moving forward, it's a mixed bag. There are many challenges and some opportunities as well. And I wanted to introduce you to some of these opportunities going forward. So first, here on the left, we have Alon Shuster, who's going to be the first minister in Israel's history who is a Reform Jew. He's a member and a supporter of one of our congregations in Sha'ar HaNegev near the Gaza Strip. He's been a strong advocate of our movement. He's part of the legal council, the public council of the movement here in Israel. He's going to be the Minister of Agriculture. Surprisingly enough, the movement in Israel gets a lot of funding from the Ministry of Agriculture. The Ministry of Agriculture used to be owned by the right wing, and they used it to channel funds to all sorts of ideological communities that were set in the different cities and tried to do educational work. Through our going to the Supreme Court, we managed to get some of that money also for our communities in the cities. And I'm hoping that with the excitement and commitment of Minister Schuster, we're going to be able to figure out new ways to support the movement. On the bottom right here is Minister Nissenkorn, who's going to be the Minister of Justice. In the past 5 years, we've had ministers of justice who were just so hostile to the Supreme Court. They compared the Supreme Court to Hamas. They spoke violently to judges. They threatened judges. And the fact that we now have a justice minister who is so committed to democracy, who is committed to equality, who is committed to protection of every citizen is a revolution for us. So for instance, with Minister Nissenkorn, we are trying to come up with a whole new attitude towards racial profiling in Israel, which is very prevalent. We're working on new regulations in terms of gender segregation, legal action against racist rabbis. The opportunities for us with Minister Nissenkorn are mind-blowing in terms of what we had just last year. So we're going to do everything we can to try and use this time that we have. We also know that no government in Israel has completed a full term since the 80s. So all of our governments fall early. And a government as diverse as this one may be very short-lived. So all of our efforts with government ministers are focused on creating sustainable long-term change. We're not only talking about getting funding this year, which we desperately need. We're talking about building the institutions within the different ministries that will be harder for the next minister to dismantle. On the top right here is Minister Chili Truppe, who is the Minister of Sports and Culture. You may remember that the movement gets funding for our rabbis through the Ministry of Sports and Culture. And we have high hopes of working with Minister Truppe, who is an advocate of religious pluralism, to increase and expand the funding that our movement gets through the ministry, and also looking at not only supporting the salaries of rabbis, but also the different activities of the different communities, in the same way that Orthodox communities are supported in a magnitude of ways. Two other very important opportunities that we know less about are these two ministers. Minister Pnina Tamano-Shata, who is the first Ethiopian born minister, who will be the Minister of Absorption, which will deal with many of our clients at the Legal Aid Center for Elim, and we're hoping to be able to work with her to improve the situation of our clients. And here on the bottom is Minister Omer Yankelevich, who is the Minister of Diaspora Affairs. She is a Haredi woman from Beit Shemesh, and we are hoping that we can build a very cooperative relationship with her. I think that both these women know very little about our movement, and it'll be up to us to introduce them and to build and cultivate a relationship with them. The movement works with the Ministry of Diaspora Affairs on different collaborative projects, and we're hoping to build on that success and expand them into the future with the new minister. So we've been very, very used to working with the opposition, and this whole new path of working with the coalition has been completely blocked to us in the past 5 years and even before that. But even with the different opposition coalition partners that we have, we still need to continue to work with the opposition. So we're going to have to work with both hands. We're going to be working with the government on the policies that we can promote. And we're going to be working with the opposition, both in terms of the protection of democracy that we're still very worried about, and also in terms of combating other trends that we're worried that this government will not address. And this is going to be a very diverse opposition. We have here Yair Lapid, who is a strong supporter in front of the movement, who was part of the blue and white party that fractured when Gantz decided to go into the government, and Yair Lapid remained to lead the opposition. So there's a big fracture. Lapid has been a very impressive leader of the opposition, being very charismatic and determined in the past weeks. And we will have to continue and build on our relationship with him even further to see how he leads the opposition. We have in the center, we have Ayman Odeh, who is the leader of the third largest party, who is the leader of the Joint Arab List. We work with him and his party on many of our issues regarding equality and the struggle against discrimination. The Joint Arab List does not want to work on anything related to religion and state. They view, many of the members of the party view the current situation of religion and state as a certain degree of autonomy given to the Muslim and Christian religious leaders, and they don't want any type of separation or interfering with the current structure. And on the right is Avigdor Lieberman, who has spent many, many years in the coalition as a leader of the right. He has been very focused on issues of religion and state in the past year. He is very interested in working with us. He's also working with us in the Zionist institutions. And again, it's a very eclectic group of people that we will have to work with. I wanted to share this photo with you. This is a Corona demonstration. You see they've marked the space for every single person to stand. And so everybody can protest peacefully while safely while social distancing. And we've had to be, and we will need to be creative in terms of figuring out ways to continue to protest during this era. And here, the voice of Israelis and the voice of you in the diaspora is crucial in pushing the government to do what is right and supporting the opposition when we need to support it. So any type of information that you can share with your friends and learn more about the topics in Israel. I know this is a chaotic time right now to be looking at anything else other than what's happening in your own city and in your own state and in your own country. But this is a crucial time for Israel, and we need all the power that we can have from here and all of your support around the world. Thank you.
Well, we have a lot of interesting questions. I have the chat box and the Q&A box up side by side on my screen. Let me group some of those. A lot of folks have asked about the impact of the Arab community. What's the likely reaction when if there is annexation on the Israeli Arab community? The question is, after the how can Arab MKs feel like what's their role in government in a Jewish state was one variant of the question. Others asked, after what happened here, how can they trust going into really making the kind of push they did to exercise their power more effectively when they have no role and it was clear neither parties really wanted to form a coalition with them. So let me start with that grouping of questions. And we have only 15 minutes, so let's try to move through as many as we can.
So I think, go ahead, Dana.
I just want to say one sentence. If we treat the Arab Israelis as the enemy, they will become the enemy. This is a quote from one of our Supreme Court judges, Theodore Orr, in his report about the events of 2020, where 15 unarmed Arab demonstrators were killed by the Israeli police. If we treat them as the enemy, they will become the enemy. They are our partners. They are almost a quarter of the Israeli population. We can't disregard a quarter of our people.
I want to add to that, just in general, to echo your question, David. We've had, the Israeli public was very, very invested in these past 3 elections. On our 3rd election in the same year, we had almost 70% voter turnout. That's a huge number. That means that Israelis were into this election and they wanted to make a difference, whether they wanted to support the annexation or whether they wanted to support the Arab list, they wanted in. And it's one of the roles of the opposition to keep people invested and have to have faith in the political system. I think that that's one of the major dangers to democracy right now, because of the blatant disregard to campaign promises that can lead to people saying, well, my vote doesn't matter if people are lying to me anyway. So I think that that's a major change. I think that the leadership of the Arab list has been very connected to the communities. You can see their impact, for instance, in the handling of the coronavirus. We've had, I think, less than 10 deaths of Arab citizens in Israel due to the coronavirus, because the leadership in the communities took such charge in maintaining the social distancing rules. And so I think that the leadership really has a strong connection with the community, and the question is whether they can continue to uphold and maintain that.
We had a couple of questions asking about the role of liberal Jews. Andy Travis was a friend of 60 years. Delighted to see him on the call. Andy Travis asked us, what is happening to the growth or proportion of non-Orthodox Jews in Israel, and what are the implications of that? Conversely, Wendy Black asked the question of, but wait a minute, with most Jews outside of Israel being progressive Jews and the Orthodox in Israel not accepting us, how do we actually do something? How do we, liberal Jews in diaspora, actually do something that can have traction on the ground in making a difference in Israel?
Go for it, Rabbi.
Well, you have such a good answer. But I think that the number of Reform Jews in Israel is increasing. It's been polled again and again. It's more than doubled in the past decade. The recent surveys are talking about 8% of Jewish Israelis identifying as Reform Jews, while and others are identifying as secular and conservative Jews and traditional Jews and others. So the numbers of Reform Jews are definitely growing. The question of how we leverage that into political power is a big question. Our communities are diverse, and so there isn't a political power structure around the reform movement right now, and building that is probably one of the challenges that we have to figure out in the future, while respecting the diversity of voices in our communities. In terms of what you can do, I think that the fact that Reform Jews are the majority around the world, or at least in North America, is a huge asset to us. And supporting us with your energy and with your connection to the consulates and with your connection to the Jewish press, the Israeli government is looking at that. The Israeli government sees the connection between Israel and the diaspora as a strategic interest. And so if you're upset about something that the Israeli government is doing, it's a great idea to say so as loud as you can. And we can harness that in order to create political change in Israel.
Yeah, if I can just add a word on this, clearly you're asking your senators and congresspersons when they travel to Israel to raise questions about the rights of the constituencies that they know that make up the majority of the people in the Jewish community have to vote for them. They should be speaking out on your behalf. Ask your friends and relatives to speak out on your behalf. all of this can help create a sense of mounting pressure on Israel. Israel's very alarmed by what these polls show, and are very concerned about dealing with it. They need to understand how much the question of the rights of Reform and conservative Jews represent. And those, as Noah was saying, those who identify with the non-Jewish streams, with the non-Orthodox streams now, total the same percentage of the population in Israel that those who identify as Haredi Jews are. I mean, we're in equal numbers about it. We're just not involved in the same way they are in organized politics. We have to be more effective advocates, like the work that IRAC and IMPJ are doing day in, day out in this regard. So there is a lot that you can do as well here. There are several questions about interesting about Donald Trump and Bibi Netanyahu here. One variant is, with so many Jews who are anti-Trump, may that give this government a pause to think about its closeness with Trump. There are others on the opposite side who are saying, look, they are so close. Is anything we're going to do make a difference? And someone pointed out that image, your first image of his standing there, Bibi, without a mask, and everyone surrounding with it, was like President Trump standing at the Ford Motor Company. Of course, you have expressions of racism in Israeli society. We've had both Joe Biden and Donald Trump in the last couple of days saying things that are offensive to the segments of the community, including Trump at Ford Motor Company, singing the praises of the bloodline of Ford himself, of Henry Ford himself, raising all kinds of resonance with his idea of eugenics and genetic of Jews being inferior here. So, you know, we all have problems like this, but any thoughts about Trump and Bibi?
I can just say very carefully to you that it's not true that all Israelis admire Donald Trump. It's true that Netanyahu has made support of Israel no longer a bipartisan support. I think it's a tremendous loss for Israel. We've always enjoyed bipartisan support, and now in the Bibi years, it's become a Republican only. And I think that's a terrible loss for Israel. There are many Israelis who have woken up to look at Mr. Trump, particularly during this Corona crisis, and wonder about the wisdom and about the how he guides the United States through this enormous crisis. Some of us are questioning.
I think that the anti-democratic trends around the world are feeding each other. That's something that we see very clearly with Bibi and Netanyahu, and also with Bibi and Putin, and also with the Trump and Putin. And that only emphasizes how important it is for liberals around the world to unite. The anti-democratic threat is not a local threat, it's a global threat. And we need to answer it both locally and globally.
That's what makes you a prophet.
Let me turn, if I may, to a final set of questions here, and ask you at the same time to wrap up any final thoughts that you have. We have a number of questions about the Supreme Court. How dangerous is the attack on the Supreme Court? What is the possibility of an override decision by an override law coming and getting passed, or any other kind of restriction on the Supreme Court? So anything to say more than you've already touched on to deepen our understanding of the nature of those threats, how serious they are, and what you're doing to try and help combat them?
So what you've said in the intro, David, about how essential our Supreme Court is to the separation of powers is basically the entire story. The reason why Netanyahu is going after the Supreme Court is because of his own issues. He wants to be able to override a conviction. And in order to do that, he wants to strip the Supreme Court of different powers so that he can get acquitted by the Knesset or do some other political maneuver. So a lot of the threats to the Supreme Court comes from that. Do I think that he, now that he's signed this agreement, has stopped working against the Supreme Court? I do not believe that for a second. I think that he is as focused on that. His legal team is minuscule. They have no way of combating the allegations. He's going to fight this court case in the public and against the Supreme Court. He's not going to fight it in court with evidence. While the threats were terrible a year ago, right now I don't see a political likelihood for these threats. But Netanyahu has managed to splinter the different political parties that were against him. And so he may, at a certain point, decide to go to another election and try again.
Gantz, do we understand right that Gantz does have the right to veto any major step in that direction?
Yes. Under the current government, they cannot pass any laws pertaining the powers of the Supreme Court, which is a huge sigh of relief. There's no democracy in Israel without the Supreme Court. There's no reform movement without the Supreme Court. All of our achievements are tied into achievements in the Supreme Court.
Another question on this,
I just want to add one thing maybe our listeners don't know. If Netanyahu is indicted on all 3 counts, he will serve 19 years in prison. This is a serious matter. That's why he's fighting so hard. 19 years.
Got it. Someone said, you know, my cousins are see the Supreme Court as an enemy now. What's been the impact in general society as you feel it? I know the data, 58% of the Israeli population supports the independence of the Supreme Court, but that means that there's a quarter to a third who would be comfortable with limiting it, and others undecided. What's the damage being done in the population of Israel in terms of its trust in the rule of law and the crucial role of the Supreme Court?
So I think that the constant attempt by Israeli leaders to equate democracy not with protection of minorities and separation of powers, but only with majority rule, has been somewhat effective. So people say, well, I voted for the Knesset, and then the Knesset can do whatever it wants, doesn't matter what. And that's been effective on a certain segment of the population. And that, you know, when we had a justice minister who said that her role is to fight the Supreme Court like the IDF should fight Hamas, then obviously that has an impact. No justice system is perfect, but ours and maybe everywhere is crucial. And so while we sometimes have a very hard time with the decisions that we get, we feel that protecting it and figuring out, continuing to find ways to express our support to the Supreme Court is crucial.
Any last words?
I want to thank David Ellis for correcting something got lost in translation. I meant if he's convicted, he's going to serve 19.
Yes.
I think everyone understood that.
Okay, no, I should understand.
So, you know, let me just also add to this discussion about the Supreme Court that this image of the Supreme Court, you know, in great numbers checking laws that the people want, or even the Knesset wants, is really bogus. You know, most people are North Americans here. Since 1992, when the basic laws were passed, the Canadian Supreme Court has struck down 46 laws. The American Supreme Court has struck down 50 laws. The German Supreme Court has struck down 206 laws. And the Israeli Supreme Court has struck down only 18 laws here. So don't get caught up in, you know, the rhetoric over this. Look, this has been a great discussion and a very timely one. I would simply say something that you wouldn't say here, which is our rights as Reformed Jews are the efforts to protect them, are spearheaded by the IMPJ and spearheaded by IRAC. Here, what you do makes a difference for each and every one of us. And you are only as strong as we are. And I think it's no secret to anyone on this call here that every major Jewish organization has been devastated by the COVID-19 virus. So for those of you who are thinking about supporting IRAC, do it now, or as much as you can do now. Here, we need to stand with them as every day they stand for us. So again, bless you in the work you do. Michael, God knows we need that.
Chodesh Tov. Thank you all.
Bye-bye.